Welcome to the House of Truth. Last last time we talked about foundational doctrines. Yeah, and it was a continuation on our previous lesson where we talked about the necessary things that we are not to add to other people to do. There's only four necessary things they need to do to be in the kingdom at all. And of course, they're the foundation of the six foundational doctrines that we talked about last week. Now, in line with that, we're talking to this today. We're going to talk about holidays, and particularly what holidays should people celebrate, and why should they not? And how should they be celebrated, or what should not be done when they're celebrated? Because and we're going to see how, and we're going to look at this in line with what we've already discussed, to not lay any other burden on people and the necessary things. That is actually the commandment we're given. We're going to begin first. We're going to begin with clarifying up a major point of confusion when people try to say this out. And we're going to start here in Genesis chapter 21, verse 8. As the child grew and was weaned, Abraham made a great feast that same day that Isaac was weaned. And the confusion is over this word feast, because like this is the King James, different translations, they'll often use the same word, English word, or whatever language it may be, other language, maybe perhaps even another language, the same word but there's three different Hebrew words that mean three different things. And it would be a lot less confusing if they just had translated them as three different English words, because there's three perfectly good English words for each one. So this one here is Mishta. And Mishta means a celebration. And Abraham is made a great celebration that Isaac was weaned. They no longer need to nurse from his mother, and he could eat whole food, eat solid food. So so that's the first one's a Mishta, and it's not the same as these others. Now, next we're going to look at is here in Exodus. The first occurrence of it is in Exodus 10, verse 8 through 9. And Moses and Aaron were brought again unto Pharaoh. He said unto them, Go serve the Lord your God, but who are they that shall go? And Moses said, We will go with our young, with our old, with our sons, with our daughters, with our flocks, with our herds will we go. We must hold a feast unto the Lord. Okay, now notice the setting here. They've not been. They're still in Egypt. None of the commandments have been given yet. Not even Passover has not even occurred yet. But there's a feast unto the Lord. And that word feast there is not mishta that we just looked at, which they just translate celebration consistently, because that's what it is. It'd be a lot less confusing. It is chag. And chag is there it comes from the word to dance, but it's got it's like a religious celebration. A holy day, if you would, which people contracted later into the word holiday. Okay, because it's not just a celebration, it's a celebration unto the Lord. It's a chag. It's got a religious element to it. Okay. But there's a third kind. A third one, and we're going to look at this right here, right now, and that's in Leviticus 23, verses 1 through 2. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak to the children, and saying to them, Concerning the feast of the Lord, which proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feast. Okay, this word here, translated feast, plural, is moedim, plural, or moed, single. And most of the time, moed is translated not into a appointed time, but an appointed place. Either the tabernacle, or as I discussed last week, it's translated as synagogue, because they had to have an appointed place. They had an appointed place all over the land for every community to meet, because it was too far to go to Jerusalem every Sabbath, impractical. So it's an appointment. And you can say these are the appointed times of the Lord. we make this a little more clear. These are my appointed times. It's like a Chag, but the Lord himself has set up the time of when it was. Notice in the previous one, there was no time element of when they were going to have this feast. No specification how long it lasts, nothing. Just we're going to have a Chag, a holy day to the Lord. But these are appointments. And now we're going to look at what these appointments are, when they're appointed. And we're going to start here in Leviticus 23, verses 3 through 8. 6 days' work shall be done. For the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Great. These are the feasts of the Lord, even the holy convocations which shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the fourth of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day at the same month is the feast of unleavened bread in the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day you shall eat a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. You shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. Okay, I'm going to explain a couple of things here. Convocation is just another word for assembly. So you're to have a holy assembly. And this, now it says no work, but it clarifies now there's servile work. What is servile work? Ordinary work. For example, it's your ordinary everyday to day work. And I discussed this at length in a previous lesson about the Sabbath, about what you can and cannot do on it. And for example, you can deal with an emergency. If a man's ox falls in the ditch, you're to go get it on the Sabbath. If someone gets hurt, if someone works in a hospital or emergency room or something, and they're reporting for duty on the Sabbath, they're doing nothing wrong. They're not violating the Sabbath, because you don't know when people are going to need help. But so the Torah does leave room for these kind of things. But servile work is regular work. It's not absolutely necessary. It's also work that you would normally do those other 6 days. And the reason why it's spelled out is because sometimes there's some things, like the priest, for example, the priests actually had to do extra sacrifices on the Sabbath and stuff. They actually did more work, but it was not secular work. It was not day-to-day work. It was work the Lord had directed. So that's not servile work. But you're not to do your regular job at all on the Sabbath, unless, of course, your job covers something like I said. And in Nehemiah's day, on the Sabbath, they stood out with spears, but they did not work on the walls, because guarding the wall was still necessary. If they'd been attacked, they would have defended it on the Sabbath because it was necessary. But you don't do anything that's absolutely not absolutely necessary. It's kind of the short version. But I want you to notice it's not just on the Sabbath. It's on these other days. These other days too are also, you got days you're not doing any servile work. On the 15th day of the first month, and on the 21st day of the first month, which is the 7th day after the 14th day. And even is the Lord's Passover. The 14th day is actually the day of preparation, if you go read all the instructions. And the lamb is slain. And why it's called the 14th day at even is the Lord's Passover, is even is that period between sunset and total nightfall. And for this reason, the Orthodox, just to be extra cautious, have 25-hour day on the Sabbath. They start on Sunday, on Friday on most of our calendars, and they end at nightfall on Saturday, because the even is actually the first hour or so, is the last hour or so of one day. It's also the first hour or so of the day after it. It's an overlap. It's a transition period there. So these feasts here, they all tie into Yeshua. They tie into him. The Passover, he was the lamb. He wrote his death took away our sin. And that's why Passover, when the lamb is killed, and Passover's ending, and first feast begins. Because his death brought about the removal of our sin. So these are some of the appointments and some of the characteristics of an appointment. We're going to read about the next set of them. Oh yeah, notice also the Sabbath itself is the first appointment, a weekly appointment, not a yearly. The rest of these are yearly appointments. They're in a context of a month of the year, or counting off from an event. They're yearly. So one weekly, and we're going to see 7 or 8, depending on how you count them. Yearly Sabbaths. We've covered the first. We've covered the first 3. You shall count ye tomorrow after the Sabbath, the day that you brought the sheep of the wave offering. 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you shall number 50 days. You shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. Okay, notice you count off from the day after the Sabbath. That'd be Sunday on our Gregorian calendars we use, our civil calendar we normally use, and that's the day that you brought the wave offering. That's the sheep. That's this first fruits that's being lifted up. Yeshua rose on first fruits on a Sunday. It's plainly stated here. The picture's exact. He rose from the dead. He's called the first fruit of those that rose from the dead. So this one, all these commemorate from the time they were written. Something occurred in the past, and foretold that it was going to happen in the future. Of course, from our perspective, some of these have all happened in the past so far. And now notice you count the Sabbaths. So this is called Shavuot, 7s, literally. This holiday, also known as Pentecost, which means 50th day, because there's 50 days, and you're counting that Sabbath of first fruits is number 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a Sabbath, so on and so forth. So, and also notice it's the day after the 7th Sabbath, again confirming it's a Sunday on our calendar. And this, of course, is when the baptism of the Holy Spirit was given. That Yeshua is the one, we're told, he will baptize you in the Holy Spirit and fire, as we saw in last week's lesson. He is the baptizer. It's a foundational doctrine of the Holy Ghost. So, and I got a lesson explaining thoroughly what they commemorate and everything, but we're going to keep it simple for right now. And just focus on Yeshua, because they're all about Yeshua, these appointments. It's why they're so important at the timing. Now, Leviticus 23, 24 through 27, we're going to read about the appointments, the other ones. Oh, and something else to bring out. The first month, by the way, is spring, Aviv, when the barley grain happens. So now we're going to go to the 7th month and start looking on the other end. So you've got one of the first month, one, and that Sunday after Passover, after the 14th day, is first fruits. You count 50th and puts you in the 3rd month on the biblical calendar, and it ranges from day 6 to day 12. A little imprecise. Well, it's not imprecise. But yes, it's not based on the day of the month or the day of the. It is based on the day of the week. It's just like holidays may be used to on the calendar, but you're used to like say, probably the best known one's Christmas. It falls in different days of the week from year to year because it's the same day of the month. The same thing happens here with Pentecost. But now we're jumping forward to the fall. 6 months have gone by. 6 biblical months. Approximately 177 days have gone by since the new year. Now, let's continue on and see what it says. Speaking of the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath. A memorial blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. Shall do no servile work therein. You shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, the 10th day of the 7th month shall be a day of atonement, shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Okay, so now the 7th month speaks of this. First of all, the word blowing of trumpets is teruah, and teruah literally means alarming. In fact, the word is used not just of blowing of trumpet of shofars in a particular way with rapid succession to sound the alarm. It's also used of blowing the chatzasorets, the silver trumpets. It's used of just people shouting in alarm. Anything that's making noise for alarming. It's literally the memorial of alarming. And you're to have this. And what's to speak of? It speaks of that trumpet that's going to blow when the dead in Christ arise, when the dead in Messiah, Yeshua, arise, and when those who are alive are caught up together with them on the second trump, which I explained before, and I may touch a little more detail because the Torah itself gives us an answer what that's referring to. Then we're going to continue on and we're going to continue on. So this is that the 10th month is what? The Day of Atonement, not the atonement of an individual that was brought about by the death of the Lamb, the atonement of Israel as a nation. The Lamb was died for their deliverance, but the nation accepts the Lamb, Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah, the nation's not going to be atoned. But the day's coming when the nation will be atoned, and that will bring an end to the tribulation. And notice this is a day of mourning. You afflict your souls, and in this day they're going to mourn for their sin. They're going to mourn for what they did to Messiah. They'll look upon whom they pierced and mourn for him as if it was their only son, as if they had personally done it to their own only son. They're going to mourn. They're going to test their ways they've had of their rebellion against God. We're talking about the Jewish people who are not believers in Messiah. That's what we're talking about here. And this is a picture of that. And the same things as before: no servile work, holy convocation. You all gather together. And I'm going to address. Well, we'll address something in a moment. We're going to address something, but notice all these things. It talks about this offering. Well, the offering can only be made at the tabernacle. We'll discuss. We're going to discuss this in a moment. We'll discuss this in a moment. I'm going to be jumping a little ahead here. Now we're going to wrap up those feasts in the fall, and we're going to start looking at how something even that God Himself ordained, Satan can pervert. We're starting in Leviticus, continue on Leviticus 23 in verses 34 through 36. Speaking of the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month is a feast of tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. In the first day shall be a holy convocation, shall do no servile work therein. 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be a holy convocation unto you. You shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord is a solemn assembly. You shall do no servile work therein. Okay, so now notice it's an 8-day thing. 7 days there's the offerings made. And they're distinguished because on the 8th day, if we say this out more, the offerings are different. It turns out, it comes out in the 8th day is almost like an appointment within an appointment. You have an 8-day festival, or we have a 7-day festival, however you want to look at, followed by another festival on the 8th day. And sometimes it's Shemini Atzeret, literally eighth day celebrate, eighth day festival, or something like that, more literally. But the rabbis call it Simchat Torah, and Simchat Torah means joy of the Torah. Simchat Torah is joy of the Torah. Okay, but there's not, and they have a lot of traditions for that are not commanded here at all. And in fact, there's even a problem with all those conditions, those traditions, which we'll discuss. We'll address a general problem that occurs a lot of times, but including with the rabbinic traditions associated with all these holidays. So this is it. But notice that it's an offering made by fire on this eighth day. And lastly, we're going to see Leviticus 23, 37 through 38. These are the feasts of the Lord which are proclaimed to be holy convocations. To offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything upon his day. Besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, besides all your free will offerings, which you give unto the Lord. Okay, and that word meat there, King James, for food. Okay, and it's talking about grains in particular, and things made from grains. And drink offerings and oblation, it's poured out. Now, but notice that all this stuff here is the sacrifice. Only one place for sacrifice, the temple. Only place the priests to carry out these things was to do these things, and was at the temple. And people have gone on and said, we must keep these things or we're not saved. Which, first of all, we'll look at that again, but as we already mentioned, we're not to lay any other burden to these necessary things, and this is not listed among them. But second of all, an appointment has not just a time, but a place. If I make an appointment with a doctor, I can't just show up anywhere at the time I made it, say another doctor's office or my work or whatever. I have to go to the place where the doctor's at. And this is why the word appointment's used. Appointed is here. And why it's usually translated an appointed place most of the time. And if you're relying on keeping these feasts for your salvation, you are going to utterly perish, because you are not keeping the appointment. Because the appointment's at an appointed place, the temple, which is not standing right now. So what do? What we are doing right now is really what we're doing is rehearsals of these. We're rehearsing, let's say, as a memorial to we're staying in practice today, doing what we can do. We cannot work on those days. We can congregate together, and some other things. Appointment, like not eat unleavened bread, except eat unleavened bread during the feast of unleavened bread, except. And we're rehearsing what will happen, how things will be when Messiah rules the earth. The temple will be back up. It'll actually, everything will be doing the way it was always supposed to be, and rarely happens. And so we're rehearsing what's to come as well. What's already happened and what's to come, just like these feasts themselves do. But there's a problem, as I mentioned, with a lot of these feasts. And the problem is not the feasts themselves, it's with people who keep them, or people in general. And Hashatan's behind it. And we're going to look at this. We're going to look at this in a very precise manner about one of these, about these appointments here in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 32 through 33. And Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah, and he offered it upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificing the calves that he had made. He placed in Bethel the priest of the high place which he had made. He offered upon the altar which he made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast of the children of Israel. He offered upon the altar and burnt incense. Okay, what's happened here is because Solomon introduced idolatry to please his multitude of wives he married, set up shrines through Israel, it angered God, and he split the kingdom into two kingdoms. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, got to keep Judah and Benjamin, and Jeroboam was given the rest. And God told him, if you will walk in my statutes and commandments, obey me, and not do like Rehoboam's done, I'll make your house as sure as the house of David. But Jeroboam did not believe him. He became afraid that if they kept going down the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, they would turn against him. He did not trust God's word, spoken through his prophet, that God would secure him. So what he did was he made a feast like it on the 8th month. Now this year, Tabernacles was in October, so it had been in November. Not near as good a time to be out camping. And he does all that camping, and he does the whole setting up the tents, all this business. But first of all, it's a different time. He made a different appointment, a different location, Bethel, not Jerusalem. And notice it's not now a chag or an appointment with the Lord, but one with the calves he made. He made golden calves like they'd worshipped in the wilderness. So what's happened here is he's totally taken the feast of the Lord and perverted it. And Hashatan does this often. A feast, a holiday, an appointment that's the Lord's, or it's supposed to be honored to the Lord or something, or in line with the Lord's commandments, gets perverted by Hashatan. Just like anything is counterfeit, the genuine always happens first. Then the counterfeit comes along. So he makes this counterfeit holiday. But that's not the only way this is done. We're looking at another one. We're looking at a different case here, a different type here in 2 Kings, over in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 20 through 24. And Jehu said, proclaim a solemn festival for Baal. And they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent through all Israel. All the worshippers of Baal came. So there was not a man left that came not. And they came to the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was full from one end to another. And he said to him that was over the vestry, put forth vestments for all the worshippers of Baal, and they brought them forth vestments. And Jehu went and Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, of the house into the house of Baal, and said to the worshippers of Baal, search and look to me that there be with you none of the servants of the Lord, but worshippers of Baal only. And they went to offering sacrifice and burnt offerings. Jehu appointed 80 men without, and said, if any man whom I brought in your hand escape, he lets him go, his life shall be for the life of him. Okay, now Jehu's actually practicing a little bit of deceit here, to be honest. But because Rehoboam's descendant, God had it with that line, and he gives Jehu the same offer he gave Jeroboam, the same offer he gave Jeroboam, and he's commanded to get rid of the worshippers of Baal. And this is Jehu's deceitful way of carrying this out. There's some outstanding things I want you to know. This is an assembly for Baal. This has nothing to do with this is not a counterfeit of something the Lord set up, of a moed, of an appointment of his, or a chag, like we saw in Exodus, of his. This is to another God. And this is not a perversion of his thing. This is a totally different holiday. It's perverted all on its own. And notice that Baal, Jehu wants to make sure there's none of the servants of the Lord there among these worshippers of Baal, because the servants of the Lord should not be there. And this, in a good example of a holiday like unto this, because these offerings they're making, among the offerings, they murdered children and things like that, okay, in their worship of Baal. So among their offerings were all these horrendous practices. In the holiday, in America, there's all they call Halloween, which is exactly similar. Matter of fact, Baal sometimes looks like a bull, the head of a bull with his arms out. Kind of a man's body with a head of a bull with big horns. Halloween, some people say Samhain, Samhain, however you want to pronounce it. The holiday it came from the religion of the Druids, which was also shared by the people of the Germans, including really among the Celts and the Nords. Okay, the Celts, the Germans, and the Nords shared all this holiday with different names because they spoke different languages, but the same idea. The horned god was who they worshipped. You ever seen pictures of Satan with horns and whatever? It's where it came from. He had not the head of a bull, but the head of a goat. Okay, and he had hands like a man, sort of like a satyr with a body with the hands with the heads of a goat, the heads of a man with the body of a goat in reverse. Okay, the horned god, and all these things were it's just a terrible thing. It got totally. It didn't get perverted. It was perverted from the beginning. It was all about sex, and this whole ideal of trick or treat came from it. In their case, you had to leave out offerings, which the Druids were just taking and eating, supposedly for the dead. If you didn't, they print a hex, they paint a hex on your house, and some of your house would die. But usually it's because the Druids killed them, not because of some, But sometimes there's something supernatural. But a lot of times it's just the Druids just first when they came out of the house, go to the restroom wherever got it, and all this kind of thing, just stoned people, and it was a terrible bloodshed and chaos, and what it was is a celebration of the winter solstice, of the beginning of winter. On the Celtic calendar, it's based on the solaric seasons, meaning you determine the seasons by how much daylight there is. In the 3 months, the least amount of daylight our current calendar is November, December, and January. Days began at sunset, just like on the biblical calendar. So at sunset on October 31st is when this happened, and they believe because darkness was setting in, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was at its thinnest, and the dead could break forth and make all these sacrifices to him. And among those, they would set up big fires where they burned somebody alive and put bits of honey near there in little containers, and the honey would harden into candy. Well, in California in the 1950s, people moved out there, started doing this, but they wanted candy, and they'd say trick or treat, and if you didn't treat them, they didn't kill you like the Druids, but they would toilet paper your yard, fork your yard, do some sort of, it was extortion basically. And of course they wore costumes, so you couldn't see it, which also the Druids, they had those big hooded things you've seen. These guys are the stuff of nightmares, literally. Most of your horror film killer things are inspired by the Druids, okay? Their practices. So, and it caught on because American candy companies, first of all, in California, started promoting it, and then the costume unions in New York started supporting it because they both had a vested interest in making money off this. They supported it, and sadly, the costume industry, the costume unions in the industry in New York was largely owned by Jewish people. Not all of them, but a lot of Jewish people were involved in this. And just as they are here, it's Jewish people are worshiping this Baal. So that holiday is likened to this one. And none of the servants of the Lord should have anything to do with it. And what people do is they try to make an alternative. And like a church I used to go to a long time ago, they made an alternative to Halloween. And the whole point was people wouldn't be out trick or treating. Have a fall festival harvest, people could wear costumes and and collect candy, which by itself was okay. But just in the context of it's like on a different day or whatever, it's okay, no big deal. But the problem was parents started complaining their kids weren't being able to go trick or treating. And their friends, with their friends, they were whining because their friends were going trick or treating, wanted to join, they couldn't because they were going to this alternative thing the church was doing. So the church actually moved it to a different day. So now it was no longer a Halloween alternative; it was a Halloween. It was a Halloween accessory. Accompaniment. Now kids can collect twice as much candy. They go trick or treating in the next night or on Sunday or whatever it was. It was just Sunday, the Sunday following Halloween's what they did. On Sunday they could go dress up and get some more candy. So it was a supplement, is what it ended up being, not a replacement. But what's to say? None of the servants of the Lord should be there. We believers should have nothing to do with Halloween. And we're going to look at that why in a moment here. And so this is not getting away from our foundation necessary things. Now we're looking at another case here in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 17 through 19, but another holiday that has a modern equivalent. And this one is, again, a little different than the other two examples we've shown. And we're going to start here in Jeremiah chapter 7, again Jeremiah 7, 17 through 19. See you not what they do in the streets of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? They gather the cities of Judah, the streets of Jerusalem. The children gather wood, the fathers kindle the fire, the women knead their dough to make cakes to the queen of heaven, and pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. Do they provoke me to anger? Said the Lord. Do they provoke themselves in the confusion of their own faces? Okay. Notice, first of all, the location. We're talking about Jewish people here. Cities of Judah, that southern kingdom we talked about. Streets of Jerusalem, where the temple is. Now, what are they doing? They're gathering wood, they're kindling a fire, they're kneading dough. All perfectly good, fine things to do. The trouble is they're making cakes to the queen of heaven and pouring out drink offerings to other gods. And that provokes him, and that's going to provoke God to anger. But they're also don't realize they're bringing all this trouble themselves. They're talking about provoking themselves to confuse their own faces. They're actually bringing a lot of trouble on themselves by doing this. God, Yahuwah, Yahweh, however you want to pronounce Yahweh, those letters, however you think is correct. Plainly was not happy with this, okay? And the problem is because they're making them to the Queen of Heaven. Now, the Queen of Heaven is the title. First of all, in the false church of Rome, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is literally called the Queen of Heaven. Why? Because Jesus is in heaven on his throne, and they believe she's up there with him. She ascended, or some say she died and she was resurrected and went up. Some say she just ascended without dying, whichever. But in some say she just in some branches actually she died. She's still buried, but her spirit's there because to be absent of the body, prayer to the Lord. That's scriptural. So regardless, she's up there ruling in heaven with him as the Queen Mother. So she's the Queen of Heaven. But there's another application to the Queen of Heaven, and this is talking about holidays that the Pilgrim stuff absolutely forbid, but they had in England until well after, called Ladies' Day, in particular, lady being Mary, and there's Mary Day and other holidays like that. They're still celebrated. The feast of Mary, etc. So the Queen of Heaven. But this title is also the title among those same Celtic, German, and Nordic people I mentioned earlier. And her name, the Queen of Heaven, is Easter. Easter is the Queen of Heaven. That's her title. And then it goes all the way back to Samaris, Nimrod's mother / wife. He married his own mother. So, goes all the way back to there. The Queen of Heaven. They taught that Easter, the goddess fertility, came down from heaven in a giant egg. And the fish rode it up on the shores of the rivers, the banks of the Euphrates River. And this story got passed down as people got scattered. And perhaps they still celebrated with eggs. Now, in the Babylonians' case, those eggs were colored, were dipped in blood of babies that were being sacrificed. And for years, that was the only color these Easter eggs came in. They'd have in the false church of Rome church. They'd have them on an altar. These red colored eggs. They claimed that red was the blood of Messiah and stuff, but it predated all that by 3,000 years almost. Okay. It predated his death, burial, and resurrection by 2,500 years, perhaps something in that neighborhood. Okay, so this and American marketers again said, "Hey, people might like eggs of other colors. We make little decorations on them, Easter eggs, and like little Debbie's used to make Easter cakes, little white cakes, often with spring decorations on them, and these were cakes of the Queen of Heaven. The word Easter is the Queen of Heaven." So it provoked God when people are eating Easter eggs. Name Easter's right there on the name of the Queen of Heaven. Easter cakes and the like, and in all that business. Like Halloween, we should not be doing this. None of the servants of the Lord should be found doing these things. Now, a lot of believers I'm acknowledging doing the ignorance. In Judah's case, they were not in darkness like the Gentiles. The Torah had been given to them. They should have known better. But now believers who know better are now responsible. God winks at ignorance, but commands repentance once you're no longer ignorant. And Easter eggs and Easter cakes and the like, eating them is a problem. And this is different. And this business, this whole Easter is different than a little different than the other two we looked at. In that the first one, they took the Lord appointment of the appointment, one of the Moeds, and perverted it. The second one was they totally perverted the holiday. They came from idolatry, had nothing to do with it. With this third case, what they've done is they've tried to marry a holiday of the Lord, first fruits, with a pagan holiday, Easter. And and they had the so-called Easter controversy in England in 664, where they're turning points in their history. And basically, the Catholic Church came and said, "Hey, we should be doing this. We should be observing the resurrection this way." And the Celtic Christians were like, "No, we should do this." And it's misnamed the Easter controversy because they weren't both celebrating Easter. Celtic Christians were celebrating Passover. We're celebrating first fruits. The people from the false Church of Rome, through this guy named Augustine, who started the Church of England, was advocating Easter instead, and wanted to rename it to Easter. In fact, in Italy today, it's called Passover in Italian. It's only called Easter in those countries that were occupied by those Germanic tribes of the Celts and the Nords. Okay, it's only called Easter there. It's literally called Passover other places. And they moved it. And just like the other thing was All Saints Day. All Saints Day was they had feast every saint, and they had the catch-all one for when they didn't catch. And they moved that to November 1st on purpose, so it'd be so the eve of it would coincide with Samhain. It could be All Hallows Eve, Halloween. So All Hallows meaning saints. People are hallowed, sanctified. The same way. So this here, but in this case, they're totally trying to marry two holidays. One commanded as a moed, and one totally against the Torah from idolatry. And notice again, is particularly is eating these cakes, making these cakes they're going to eat, is provoking God, because this goes against those necessary things. Here we are. We're going to look at this here in Acts 21:25, where they're repeated again. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written to conclude they observe no such thing, save only they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from things and from strangled, and from fornication. In the context, they're talking to Paul, who himself went to the temple, was in charge of people, helped pay for a sacrifice, for the sacrifice required for ending a Nazirite vow, which he started in Kinshasa before he left. He took a vow, which was on a Nazirite vow. When he got there, he shaved off his head, he shaved off the hair in his beard and did all this business. And so, and the Philippians were trying to put these Gentiles under the law, meaning they had to keep all these feasts we're talking about in the Sabbath and so on and so forth. And they observe no such thing, but these four things are necessary, as we talked about. You notice the first was things offered to idols. Those cakes offered to the Queen of Heaven. Those drink offerings poured out to idols. You are not going to get in the kingdom of heaven if you're doing those things, because we would not have you fellowship with demons. We're told, as we saw last week. So if you want to celebrate the resurrection of Messiah, that's totally fine. But observe first fruits. Do what the Torah says to do. Do what Yeshua himself did. He rose again on first fruits. But it's a serious problem. In the Halloween candy, the same thing. You're eating food offered to an idol. At least that's where it originally started. I know it's been blurred and people have lost that context over the centuries. That is its origin. And we need to get back to obedience to God's word. Now we're sort of addressing another question. Because a common it teaches them to observe these feasts of the Lord, these appointments. So they're the only thing people can observe. And there's a little disagreement. There's some argument about them when people observe the Sabbath, except. We're going to look and see what the Word of God says about this. And we're going to start here with establishing authority. Looking at what the authority that's given to the ruler here in Numbers chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. And the Lord spoken to Moses, saying, make you 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece you shall make them. You shall use them for the calling of the assembly, for the journey of the camps. And when they shall blow with them, the assembly shall assemble themselves to you at the door at the tabernacle of congregation. All right, this is the Chesed Torah I was talking about earlier, the silver trumpets, okay? And now, who's the they that blow with them? Is the priest. And if they didn't blow them for an alarming, that was a particular way of blowing them, but just blew them like long, loud blast. They blew them once. The leaders came. Those who went before the others came first. The leaders. If they blew a second time, the whole congregation was to come, was to assemble. In the same way, back to the Feast of Trumpets we was talking about earlier, the day of alarming, Yom Teruah. In the same way, at the first trump, those who are dead in Messiah are going to rise. Those who went before are going to meet with him. And at the second trump, the whole congregation is going to meet with him. But the whole congregation is only the worthy. Luke 21:36, he says, watch and pray that you're counted worthy to escape all these things. Not every casual Christian on earth is going to escape the tribulation, is going to meet him. They're not all going to hear the call. Just those who are watching and waiting, those who are watching, listening for that call, are going to hear it. So, but Moses is not the head of the religion. He's not the priest. The priest is Aaron, his brother. He is the political leader. He's the ruler, the head of the congregation. And the head of the congregation is the one who's given the commandment to call assemblies. Only the head of the congregation or the ruler is to call these assemblies. Now we're going to look and see where this is put in practice in 1 Kings chapter 8, 1 through 2. Chapter verses 1 and 2. When Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children, unto King Solomon in Jerusalem, might bring an ark of the covenant of the Lord out of David, which is Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon, the feast of the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. Okay, notice Solomon's assembling them, and it's in the 7th month. Now, Ethanim is the first time besides the word Aviv is used to name a month. In the Torah, it's just first, except for Aviv, and it's only called that once or twice to identify it, which was the Philistine, which is the name the Philistine Canaanites were using for the first month, meant spring, literally spring. I think springing out of the ground, not like, well, yeah, the spring's called that because that's when the season was things spring out of the ground. Okay, that was, but here's this one. Here's the Ethanim, which is again the Canaanite and Philistine name for the 7th month, which they got by observation by looking, but they declared it based on when they saw the new moon, and that's where this idea of observation came from. And I discussed before in a previous lesson, the Babylonians were more sophisticated, more mathematically more sophisticated, calculated it. But initially, until the Urim and Thummim were taken away, it wasn't given by observation or calculation. It was determined by revelation. The high priest, had the Urim and Thummim over his heart, and to tell him, and he declared it. He told him to blow trumpets over the morning sacrifice or not, or the evening sacrifice, I should say, or not, to indicate the beginning of the first month on the 29th day, or wait one more day to the 30th day. But he did it by revelation. And that was the way it was done in the Torah, until Israel screwed things up and lost those things. So, but Solomon here is now calling these people. And what's he calling them to an assembly for in the 7th month? Remember, Yom Teruah is in the 7th month. So is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. So is So is Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, so he's calling them that month of those feasts, those fall feasts we talked about. So they occur in the fall season. Now, we're going to see his purpose down here towards the bottom of chapter 8, in 1 Kings chapter 8, 63 through 66. And Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to the Lord 220,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. The same day did the king howl the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings and meat offerings and the fat of peace offerings, because the bays and altars before the Lord was too little to receive the burnt offerings and the meat offerings and the fat of the peace offerings. At that time, Solomon held a feast, and all Israel with him, a great congregation from entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt, before the Lord our God, 7 days and 7 days, even 14 days. On the 8th day sent the people away, and they blessed the king and went into their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness the Lord had done for David his servant, and for the people, and for Israel his people. Okay, so I want you to notice some outstanding things about this. First of all, it's in the 7th month. The 8th day is that Shemini Atzeret, which we talked about earlier, or Atzeret Shemini. Anyways, it's Atzeret Shemini. Anyways, we talked about earlier. that eighth day, the Feast of Tabernacles. So this first 7 days, these last 7 days what's these other 7 days? This is a cog. The word cog is actually used here, okay, in this passage. That Solomon, where it says he held a feast, he held a cog, a holy day, a religious celebration for 7 days. It was not one established in the Torah. It was not an appointment God made as one the king made. The king had authority to call an assembly, and he did. And notice what else he did. He hollowed out the middle part of the court. It was in front of the house of the Lord. So out there you have this big courtyard before you get into the house of the Lord. And he just roped it off, declared it holy, and made a bunch of offerings himself. So the king, the ruler, has established a new holy day unto the Lord, a new Chag, with new ordinances and new means of celebrating at a new time. The 7 days before the normal 8-day feast. And Yahuwah was plainly okay with this. He blessed the whole event. Fire came down from heaven and consumed and let the fire to consume the sacrifices that they were making these sacrifices on. The Shekinah showed up so great. The Shekinah, the glory of God, showed up so great that the priest could not even stand to minister. The Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, was there in such power, people fell over. God plainly put his stamp of approval on this. So the ruler can declare another holy day as long as it's a holy day to the Lord or holiday to the Lord. He didn't make this to Baal like the other guy did. He didn't pervert one. He didn't pervert one, take one of the Lord's and pervert it. This is a separate one he made. But it's to the Lord, to Yahuwah, and Yahuwah approved it because he is the ruler, and that was in line with the Torah. He could assemble people and declare this if he wanted to, and he did. But he's not the only one. We're going to look at another case of this later. That happens later in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 24 through 28. When Judah came forward toward the watchtower in the wilderness, they looked in the multitude, and behold, they were dead bodies fallen to the earth, and none escaped. And when Jehoshaphat and his people came to take away the spoil of them, they found among them in abundance both the riches of the dead bodies and precious jewels, which they stripped off themselves, and more than they could carry away. And they were they were 3 days in carrying the spoil. It was so much. In the 4th day, they assembled themselves in the valley of Berakah, for there they blessed the Lord. Therefore, the same place is called the valley of Berakah unto this day. And then they returned, every man of Judah and Jerusalem, and Jehoshaphat in the forefront of them, to go again to Jerusalem with a joy, for the Lord had made them to rejoice over their enemies. They came to Jerusalem with psalteries and harps and trumpets into the house of the Lord. And as the 4th day, the king calls an assembly. And they have a celebration. Why is he celebrating? Deliverance from their enemies. This is that story many people are familiar with, where the king, where the Lord gives instructions to put the singers in front of the army. And when they began to sing and praise the Lord, and blow the trumpets, the enemy, God said, if the priests blow those, when your enemy comes against you, I'll be with you and sing confusion. That's exactly what happened. And the armies of 3 countries had joined together as allies, and they started to come against Judah, the kingdom of Judah, just the southern kingdom of Judah, and they started fighting with each other, and they killed every last one of them. They fought until every last one of them was dead to the last man. And there's more they could carry away. They have to stop after 3 days because after 3 days, decay starts setting in, and the people stinketh. It said about Lazarus. Lazarus, he stinketh by now. Out there, it took about 3 days for people for dead bodies start smelling terrible. So they just carried off all this wealth with them. So he made a holiday on the 4th day. And again, he was celebrating the victory of the Lord, and the Lord was plainly okay with this. Now we're going to look at another one, because some people have said, well, we shouldn't be keeping this holiday because Mordecai declared this holiday, and who gave him the right to do this, and blah, blah, blah. Well, let's just see. Let's look at this holiday. Esther chapter 9, verses 19 through 22. Therefore, the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting, a good day, and sending portions one to another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent to all the Jews that were in the province of the king of Ahasuerus, both fair and nigh and far, to establish among them they should keep the 14th day of Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly. As the day wherein the Jews rest from their enemies, and the month which was turned to them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning to a good day, that they should make the days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. The first thing you know, it's the month of Adar. Now we're using Babylonian names, which are calculated months. So we get the idea of a calendar from calculated. Okay? And apparently God didn't have a problem with them doing this, Yeshua. Yahuwah had no problem with them using this, calculated month to figure out these days. And notice the date, the 14th day. It's exactly 1 month before Adar's the 12th month. If you read the story, you know this. And in a normal year, not a leap year, there's 12 months. So it's 1 biblical month before Passover. And the 15th day, the same day is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a month before that. But he's not doing like that guy and perverting one of the Lord's holiday and moving it forward. It's a different holiday called Purim. And it's what? Celebrating God's victory over them, over their enemies who tried to wipe them off the face of the earth. But instead, their enemies were wiped off, just like we saw earlier a few moments ago with Jehoshaphat. And Mordecai is the ruler. In fact, he's made ruler. He's not just ruler of the Jewish people. He's made ruler second only under the king, prime minister over the whole Persian Empire. The ruler can call an assembly anytime he wants, and he can establish a holiday. And that's exactly what a holy day to the Lord. Not to an idol, but to the Lord. And that's exactly what Mordecai did. And this holiday is called Purim. It occurs in a normal year, 1 biblical month before Passover. Now we're going to continue. We're going to look at this thing about Purim and just settle that it was is approved by the Lord, just like the others we looked at. First, in John chapter 5, 1 through 2. And there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. There was a Jerusalem by the sheep mark of the pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now, this feast of the Jews is not named here, but you find out in chapter 6, he goes to Passover. And you do a little calculating out. You'll find, and this is a month before he went before Passover. This is Purim, and Jesus felt it was important enough to go there to do this. And this is when the man had been lame all those years. Was laying there and he couldn't get in the water that was troubled, and Yeshua healed him. during this time, because remember, you're supposed to give gifts to the poor and stuff. He gave this poor beggar the gift of walking. Okay, he's fulfilling the commandment there that Mordecai had left by doing so. And if he's in Galilee prior to this, if he walked around Samaria, it took him 3 days to get to Jerusalem to do this, to be able to Purim. It took 3 days to get back if he walked around. If he walked through Samaria, it took him 2 days. Either way, some serious walking to be at this holiday, because it's put in here so for our benefit to know it was approved by Messiah himself. So even though it's not an appointment with God, the king can declare a holiday to celebrate something good that the Lord's done if he wants to. And now in this one, was done so by Mordecai. It was again approved by Messiah himself. Now let's continue on with Daniel chapter 8, verse 21 through 22. And we're going to talk about that other holiday, sometimes incorrectly called Jewish holiday, that other holiday that's not commanded in the Torah, but people who meet on the Sabbath often observe, and that's Passover. And we're starting by looking at the context again here in Daniel chapter 8, verse 21 through 22. The context of what was going on. In the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn is between his eyes of the first king. Now that being broken, whereas the four stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Okay, so it's about Alexander the Great. He dies, and the Greek Empire, which is massively huge, gets broken into 4 mini empires. And one of them, the Seleucid Empire, was roughly the same size as the United States, perhaps even a little larger. So, so it got broken into 4. And that's one of them. And that's the one that's important we're going to look at in the context of Hanukkah. And it's discussed what's going to happen from Daniel's perspective in the future, but from our perspective, the past. Arms shall stand up in this part. Again, Daniel chapter 11, verse 31 through 33. Arms shall stand up in this part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and shall pollute the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupted by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. They understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Okay. All right, there's three main groups of actors we're going to talk about that you need to know about here. First is the they, okay? They that do wickedly against the covenant, they that pollute the sanctuary strength, are, as we've seen in all our previous cases concerning Baal worship and everything, Jews that are not obeying the Torah. Yeah, they're physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they're not obeying the Torah. And what happened was, after these generals broke up these empires, they wanted to make everything the Greek way. And the Jew in Judea, as the Greek as they are called, they went along with it as far as wearing Greek clothing and speaking Greek language and blah blah blah, until the certain part where this divisive thing comes, where they want them to start worshiping Greek gods. And a lot of the Jewish people just signed on to it. Just like they signed on to worshiping with Baal and everything else. And they did wickedly against, and they joined this man, the emperor of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes. Those they're the ones that actually polluted the sanctuary. And under his direction, they took away the daily sacrifice. And they're the ones that actually set up the abomination. This is like Nebuchadnezzar having a big statue of himself made, except they made it and set it up in the temple. They polluted the temple. That's what they meant by doing wickedly against the covenant. And they corrupt them with flatteries. But those who knew their God, who knew Yahuwah, who knew the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were strong and did exploits. And they started with an elderly priest in Moadine, in a city called Moadine. I'm sorry. Anyways, they demanded a sacrifice. He refused to give it. Another younger Jewish man stepped up to give it on his behalf. And he grabbed a sword from one of the guards standing there and killed the Jewish man to keep him from making the sacrifice. And he literally headed towards the hills. He was joined by his 5 sons, the leader of whom was called Judah, and a nickname of Maccabee, meaning the hammer. And one reason he got that was he had this name because he participated in Greek athletes, and Greek athletic events was actually quite excelling in them. And that's kind of where he started. I think the hammer throw was maybe one of his things where he excelled at. But anyway, he got this nickname, the hammer, the Maccabees. That's what Maccabee means, hammer. So they stood up against the largest army in the world, and they beat them time after time again. And finally, they won, and they were able to get rid of the filth in the temple and rededicate the temple. And it took them 8 days to clean the temple, to get rid of all this abomination that was desolate of worshipers of the true God. To make them worshipers of the true God, could come there where God himself would accept the sacrifices and resume the sacrifices again. They dedicated the temple just as Solomon had done with earlier. But it was very costly to them. They instructed many. This is how people knew what to do. Remember, he's a priest. Matthias is a priest. So the job of the priest is to teach. It's primary job. So they instructed them how to carry it out and so on and so forth, and how to walk in the way of the Torah. But it was very costly to them. Matthias and 3 of his sons died in this long protracted war. It went about 1,260 days, about 3.5 years, and many of them perished, as it says. But in the end, they prevailed. They did exploits, and to commemorate this, a holiday called Hanukkah. And we see here in John chapter 10, verse 22, where Yeshua puts his stamp of approval on Hanukkah. And it was at Jerusalem the feast of dedication, and it was winter. All right, Hanukkah means dedication. And this is where Yeshua announced 2 things. It's also known as the Festival of Lights, because of the 8 days. The story of the miracle of the oil wasn't made until 500 years later. It was made around 350 BC, 330 BC. I mean AD. I'm sorry. And these events happened to 165 AD. Okay, it was around 500 years later when the miracle of the oil was added. That whole story, totally fabricated and made up, and it takes away from the real miracle. The real miracle is a tiny country smaller than, say, Uganda today, was able to beat back and defeat the largest army on earth, a empire larger than the United States. And by the way, the other side also, the larger side, the Seleucids had all the technology advantage and everything else as well. But they still nonetheless were able to beat them. But it's because of their dedication. Well, Yeshua himself announces at this festival, he's the light of the world. He also announced he's the good shepherd and talks about his dedication. He talks about he's dedicated to the sheep. He'll lay down his life for them. He's dedicated to the Father. He'll lay down his life at the commandment of the Father. And his sheep's dedication to him, that the sheep hear his voice and will not listen to another. And he thought this was so important again. Notice it's winter. It's cold in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has gotten 2 feet of snow at a time in modern times in the winter. I live in Oklahoma, and it's not, it's about weather there is very similar in the winters to this where I live in a lot of ways. And he walked again 2 to 3 days each way to be here for this festival, for this 8-day feast of dedication. He plainly put his stamp of approval on it. So the thing is, it's totally fine. And like, as I mentioned earlier, it's totally fine to have a holiday set aside in recognition of the Lord, Yahuwah, Yahweh, however you like to pronounce Yahweh, or just God, if you're speaking, for speaking English, as long as we don't bring in things from idolatry and pervert them, or we don't. It's not fine to make a holiday or even celebrate one having to do with one that came from something from idolatry, like Diwali, or I can't remember the name of that Indian holiday where they have the color run. It's got a name that actually means something in English, and it's kind of funny. But anyways, we can't. It doesn't. It's not okay to do those. But it's definitely okay to any holiday declared by the ruling authority who can assemble things and declare a holiday to celebrate God's victory and God's greatness and give thanks to God for what he's done is certainly acceptable. Now we're going to continue on we're talking about a few more holidays that are they're here in America. There's perhaps similar ones other places. And we're going to talk about them in the context of what we've learned. We're starting here in Exodus 20, chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your mother and father, that your days may be long on the land where the Lord God gives you. Okay, notice this: honor your mother and father. That's a commandment. This is where the 10 Commandments are given. This is one of them. And here in America, we had a holiday established in 1907 by a woman whose mother died in 1905, and she did this to honor her mother. And it actually didn't start as a national holiday. It started out just in the church, and they had a day of prayer, an annual day of prayer called Mother's Day. It had nothing to do with Mother Earth or Cybele from Greek mythology or anything like that. She made this day to honor her mother, and she worked to get it made a national holiday here in the U.S. And later, because Americans, the greeting card companies and the florists saw economic opportunity, they commercialized it, and she actually tried to get it rescinded because it got totally away from her purpose of just honoring your mother. And Father's Day was similar. Mother's Day was a woman whose father who had 6 children. This woman had 5 brothers. When her mother gave birth to the last child, the youngest brother, she died in childbirth. Her father raised them all by himself with her help, all of them. And she wanted to honor him, so she made Father's Day. It had nothing to do with Zeus or anything else, or even God the Father in the Bible. It had to do with her own father. It was a way of honoring her father, and she petitioned Congress. She got Mother's Day. I want Father's Day to honor fathers as well, and particularly to honor her father. In that context, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you going out on this day, on Father's Day or Mother's Day, and going out and taking your parent out and eating them and giving them some sort of gift if you want to, or take them their favorite movie or celebrate with them however you want to celebrate. Or just stay at home and just letting them know how much you appreciate them and honor them, because that was the purposes of them to begin with. But like the very holidays we saw from the Torah itself got perverted, and not just by that one king, but the rabbis have also perverted them often. Like they call Yom Kippur Rosh Hashanah. You know, the end of the year, that term Rosh Hashanah is actually used in the Bible one place, and it's used on the first day of the first month. But hey, what's the Bible know? I mean, the Bible must have it wrong. It's here the 10th day of the 7th month, you know. Okay, well, it's not Rosh Hashanah. It's Yom Kippur. Okay, it's not Yom Teruah. It's not Rosh Hashanah either. It's Yom Teruah. And these things like Simchat Torah, they parade the Torah around and blah blah blah. All came from Babylon. They didn't do this before they went to Babylon. In Babylon, they paraded their gods around, their god around. Marduk, I believe his name was. They paraded him down the processional way, which the ruins of are still in Iraq. You can go see them if you want to. Down the processional way, okay, and they paraded him, and well, they just substituted a Torah scroll for that idol. But the practice actually came from this idolatrous religion, just like Easter eggs were transferred to have to do with the resurrection of Yeshua when they have nothing to do with that. Same thing. And in the same way, Mother Day and Father's Day have been perverted in some places. People have taken things that came from worship of talking about Mary, the Queen of Heaven, being mother of the church, the false church of Rome, and different things. But that was a perversion. If you want to celebrate it for its original purpose, and you want to honor your mother and father, you're actually doing something in line with the Torah. Just don't be bringing in practices from idolatry in so doing. Which brings us to another one. And we're going to discuss it here in Leviticus 22, verse 29 through 31. When you will offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, offer it at your own free will. On the same day it shall be eaten up. You shall leave none of it till the morrow. I am the Lord. Therefore you shall keep my commandments and do them. I am the Lord. Okay, remember. Now, Thanksgiving in America came from this. Really, Thanksgiving as we know it wasn't a single holiday the Pilgrims celebrated. It really came from 4 different events. One was they were observing the fast, and because the biblical calendar compared to the Gregorian calendar jumps around, the same way people familiar with Easter moves around within a month windows. Well, all these holidays compared to the Gregorian calendar do that. In this particular year, it was close to the same time. It was originally in October, but because Feast of Tabernacles celebrates the harvest, the end of the harvest festival as well. It even says that in the Torah. Okay, it's your ingathering, your harvest. Okay. Well, because of that, but as you went further south, the harvest was a little later, so it kept being a little, or celebrated on the same day or nothing. But in Plymouth Colony, what they actually had was twice. There were two times they were celebrating tabernacles, and because of the moving around, one of them ended the day before a British holiday, a pagan holiday called Michaelmas. Another year, it started the day after Michaelmas. People thought, well, it's Michaelmas. No, it has nothing to do with Michaelmas. It was just coincident in the calendar. And that's when and one of those is when the Native Americans showed up for 3 days. And if you go look at that year and go look at when Sukkot was, you understand they sent them off before the Sabbath, before the Sabbath, and because part of it overlapped the Sabbath because it goes 8 days. So and they were preparing those other ones. So that's why the Native Americans are there 3 days. Well, there's a fast in these twice, but then about 20 years later, the governor, the ruler of Plymouth Colony, declares a day of Thanksgiving on the 29th of November. He's the ruler. He can do this. He can declare a day for the Lord, to give thanks to the Lord if he wants to, and he did. So thus be and it just caught on. But the problem was it was because of these different roots of it and these different groups and went to different places, and because harvest times being at different locations, it was all over. It was over like a 2-month period almost. You would have different celebrations of this in all the states and when it became the United States. So Abraham Lincoln made it a national holiday, and he picked the 29th. The 29th of November happened to be a Thursday when the governor did it. And the reason why I picked the Thursday, by the way, so it wouldn't interfere with the observance of Passover at Friday sunset. That's why it's on Thursday, not which seems like it's the only holiday it's like it, unless we're on Monday or something. But he picked it on that way, so it wouldn't interfere with the observation of the Sabbath, because the Pilgrims observed the Sabbath. The strangers who came with them and overwhelmed them eventually and led to the destruction of the colony did not. But the Pilgrims themselves were Browning separatists who observed the Sabbath. So when they fear the Sabbath, they set it on Thursday. Well, Abe Lincoln sets it on the last Thursday of November. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to move it to the third Thursday of November to make the Christmas shopping season longer to stimulate the economy. And a compromise was reached with Congress. They made it to the 4th November. The fourth Thursday of November. But its purpose has never changed. And they're the rulers of the time, and they can do that. As long as it's Thanksgiving unto the Lord, we can do this. We can operate of our own free will. And also notice how none of it's eaten up till morning. Traditionally in America, people stuff themselves on Thanksgiving. Originally, they were doing it in Plymouth Colony for this reason. You couldn't leave it till tomorrow. Well, everyone eating had to get burnt if you follow the instructions of the Torah. So therefore, the thing was, what we make, we're going to try to eat all of it. Okay. So people have got this tradition of stuffing themselves with Thanksgiving, don't know why they're doing it. This is why they're doing it. So again, nothing wrong with doing this. The authority, the ruler certainly has the authority to do so under the Torah, as we've looked. And it's not to an idol, it's to a God. And the only thing you need to watch out for that I know of, Thanksgiving, is if you got a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, one of those usually wicker baskets shaped like a horn. Sometimes you see them with pictures of fruit and stuff. People paint them in with the pictures. The pilgrims would have been abhorred to have one. They would have not had one. There's a couple sources for that. One's Greek mythology concerning Zeus supposedly hidden in the horn, and so his father didn't eat him. By his nurse. And the other one was back from that same religion, the Celts, the Nords, and the Germanics. That horn was like was similar to the horn of the horned god, another god that had horns, and it was a symbol of his provision to them. That he provided things for them. So if you have one of these cornucopias, get rid of that thing, get it off your table. It's an abomination. Okay. But other than that, these things of Thanksgiving, it's certainly pure and right and good to give a day of thanks to the Lord. And people have argued, well, they fasted. No, that was because that day that people mistaken for Thanksgiving. On the actual one declared by the governor, they actually ate. Okay. It was a feast, as translated. Now, we're going to cover one last passage to cover other holidays, all other types of holidays, or what we mentioned. Zechariah chapter 8, verses 18 through 19. And the word of the host came to me, saying, thus is the Lord of hosts, the fast of the fourth month, the fast of the fifth, and the fast of the seventh, the fast of the 10th, shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness and cheerful peace. Therefore, love the truth and peace. Okay, these were all fasts. Notice they're fast, indicating mourning for disasters that happened in the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th month. And they all had to do with the Babylonians coming, destroying the temple, and eventually hauling Judah out of the land. And when they're going to be turned, notice the Lord's not angry. They have these. He's not rebuking them. He's actually going to keep them and change their purpose. They're not going to be fast days of mourning, but days of gladness and cheerful feast. Cogs, by the way, if I remember correctly here, cogs. Okay, holy days. And what? And what's it? And these signify memorials of tragic events, or the death. The seventh one is about the death of Gedaliah, and the assassination of Gedaliah by Ishmael and his gang was Israel's final rebellion. The Lord said, prophet said, "Hey, just go along with them, stay here, and the rest of you can stay in the land, and and you can prosper here. You don't even have to get drug off." And most of them wouldn't have anything to do with it. They support this guy. Gedaliah was the governor appointed. The governor Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar appointed a governor of their own people over them, let them stay in the land, and they rebelled and assassinated him. And that led to them being dragged off to those hardly no one left in the land. Just a few of the very poorest were told to maintain it. God always left a remnant in Israel. There's never been a day where there wasn't some Jewish person living in Israel, particularly around the vicinity of Jerusalem, not necessarily in it, but in that vicinity. And they left that as a witness, but that was it, just a very few. He likened it to one person out of a city, okay? It was one place where it's likened. Well, this is about remembering the death day of a good and godly man who followed. And in our day, someone like that would be like St. Patrick, who I mentioned before. St. Patrick, a lot of Celtic people thinks he was Jewish. And the reason was because the same Catholic, the false church of Rome, the Catholic Church particularly, has sold people on with their so-called history. Again, like the rabbis wrote 500 years after his death, they wrote a history of the man, okay, by a couple of guys called Probiscus and Jocelyn, or Jocelyn Probiscus, and they were sent there to write. They were sent there. A couple of monks were sent there to convince the Celts, that the Celtic Christians, that St. Patrick was a Catholic and they should become Catholics like him. And their deception was largely successful. However, we know it's deception because it's not the only testimony of him. This history, all in quotes, written 500 years after the fact. The Church of England was started by a guy named Augustine, who was a monk at the time, sent over, and he was sent over to convince. He was sent over initially to talk to the Celtic Christians to see what it would take to bring them into the Catholic fold. And his report is very interesting. Here's what he said. He says, "I don't think this is going to work for us. They don't meet on Sunday. They meet on the Sabbath." This is a report. They keep the same holidays as the Jews, those Moedim we just talked about, okay? Not our holidays. They only eat what the Jews call clean. Those things the Bible calls clean. So they didn't eat pork, except, okay? And St. Patrick warned them to have nothing to do with us. St. Patrick's own journal, of which only 87 paragraphs survive, tells us a lot about him that's very contrary to them. He spoke in tongues according to his own journal. Also, he expects to be murdered every single day, in his own words. There's a horrendous persecution all the time. And he didn't, sink islands into the sea and all this nonsense you hear about. He did perform miracles, but they were in line with those we looked at last week. Healing and the blind seeing and the deaf hearing and same kinds of things Yeshua did, right? They did do those. They didn't do those kind of, split rocks and the rock come up and swallow up a castle or anything like that type nonsense. Okay, that stuff was all made up. some have been perhaps legends that have been people have built up around him in this Jocelyn gel, this Jocelyn, this Procelyn, this Jocelyn, I'm sorry, Provincius wrote down and embellished and whatever and showed him as being Catholic when indeed he actually warned his followers to have nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. So remembering him is fine. Remembering him on, if you want to on St. Patrick's Day, remember him, a man that did God's will, who carried out the gospel all the way and brought the gospel and brought the Celtic people out of darkness into light. That's fine. Just don't bring anything pagan from it, anything from pagan. Like touching the Blarney stone, which you would have been rebuking them for, or anything like that, okay, or kissing the Blarney stone, or any of that business, okay. But you want to, and also, and likewise, things like Memorial Day are fine to remember those who sacrificed their lives so we could be safe, so we could be free, and that kind of thing, who died in these wars, these disasters, okay, or anything like that is just fine. If the ruler declares it, and particularly if it's to bring attention and focus on the Lord and what He's done, and it's not, then it's totally fine to celebrate. We're just not to celebrate ones that are like we saw with Baal. They're focused on an idol god, and the ones that are okay, not to bring in anything from idolatry, incorporate them into them. And of course, I'd be remiss to leave out the biggest holiday of all I mentioned earlier, Christmas, and everything about it is like Halloween. Yeshua was born. The shepherds were out with their sheep and without their flocks. They're only out there 17 days a year in the lambing season. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, the lambing season's in the spring. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's in the fall, because that's Australia's spring. When Israel's having fall, Australia's having spring weather. Okay, but so it's in the spring on the Gregorian count, the spring months in the northern in Israel. In the fall months on the Gregorian calendar in the south of the equator. And it's only during a 7-day period. It's only when the shepherds are out with their sheep, because the sheep will step on the lambs and kill them if you put them in a pen together. So you have to get them out at night, which exposes them to a lot more danger from predators, a lot more danger from thieves. A lot of just steal them when they're all scattered all over. And not a bunch together in a pen with a guy guarding the gate. And there's a number of ways we're told about the birth of John the Baptist. We're told these kings were the reign of these four kings, these four rulers when John the Baptist began his ministry. And you can and if you understand how the ruler thing works, there's only a small gap when all those statements are true, a small number of days. You can calculate backwards from there to get John the Baptist's birth and go like 6 months forward to get Yeshua's, and you end up with the same time frame. The first day of he was born on it would appear he's born on the first day of the first month of biblical calendar, which makes sense since all these holidays and stuff are about him. His birth came before his death. Okay, makes sense. His death came before his resurrection before the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit being poured out before his gathering of people, before his gathering people to begin before the tribulation. The believers in the air with him, or snatching away of them before the end of the tribulation, the beginning before the end, makes sense. When all of Israel atoned, followed by his rule in the eternal state, signified by the Feast of Tabernacles on that 8th day. Doesn't make any sense for him to be born in the middle of all that. Makes sense he's born at the beginning. But it certainly was not December 25th. That was a holiday dedicated. It was Sol Invictus. It was the first day of winter, and because of Julian, because of the Gregorian correction yet, because it's not quite 365 1/4 days, a little smidgen less. So The Gregorian correction is on years that end with 0, you see if they end with 400. So if they don't, you don't have a leap year that year. So 1900, 1800, 1700 did not have a leap year, but 2000 did. Well, because they had not caught on to this slight miscalculation, I mean, really it's Augustan, but we'll call it Julian calendar they were using. When they declared his birthday on Sola Victus, it was December 25th. When they corrected it, they went in the first day of winter, went back to December 20th or 21st being of the year. They selected on the 25th. They've been celebrating for the 25th for years. And it was combined with one called Saturnalia, 12-day holiday. We get the 12 days of Christmas from. It has nothing to do with the birth of Messiah. There's going to be nothing wrong with you celebrate with you observe. If anyone's birthday deserves to be celebrated, it's his. But if you're going to do it, don't do anything. Don't drag anything from paganism, and don't do it on a day far away from when he was actually born. If you want to do something on the first day of the first month. You're going to be if not the day he's born, they're very close to it. And you want to sing praises to God for the greatness of sending Messiah as a babe on that day? Awesome. But stay away from things from idolatry, because it's tied to eating things food offered to idols like Christmas hams, which again were originally also food offered to idols. And we're to avoid those as are necessary things to avoid. But so observe holidays, but don't do anything contrary to the Bible in your doing so. Make sure they honor God and have nothing in them from idolatry. That's all I've got for this week. Until next week, shalom.